like to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the ARCO Forum of the Institute of Politics, and also on behalf of the sponsors of this evening's event, the China Current, the Harvard University, the Harvard Chinese Student Scholar Association, and the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee. There was an addition of MIT here, which apparently was in error. This apparently is an all-Harvard event in this particular case, although audience is welcome from everywhere. My name is Dwight Perkins. I'm director of the Harvard Institute for International Development, and I'm moderator for the discussion tonight. The topic of this discussion, as I think you are all aware, is United States-China trade from copyrights to the World Trade Organization. Now, we're going to, in this discussion, we're going to begin by talking specifically about the trade agreement that has recently been completed, and then we're going to expand out from there to a broader discussion of trade relationships between U.S. and China and the broader economic and diplomatic relationships between our two countries. As most of you know, U.S.-China trade has been in the news a great deal over the last year and a half. It was just over a year ago that there was a vigorous debate going on, settled early in the summer, on the question of whether the United States would continue to give most favored nation treatment to China. In the last few months, we have had the vigorous discussion of intellectual property rights and who was making what, where, and with what degree of authorization in China. These have been hot topics, very much in the news, even more in the news if you were in Asia watching Hong Kong television or whatever. The issues that we are going to be dealing with tonight are at one level pretty straightforward economic issues. They're the question of who pays how much for what. There's a question of how vigorously does China make people obey the laws of commerce, obey its own laws. What is the role of the United States in enforcing such laws, if any? But there's also the broader issues that we will get into in this discussion, issues that go beyond the question of intellectual property rights, go beyond the question of whether there's pirating or not. There's a long tradition, as those of you who lived in Asia, and a tradition elsewhere as well, that there has been a great deal of pirating of books and records in the early stages of development. So one of the questions, of course, is this something that is characteristic of the early stages of development that goes away naturally, or is it something that has to be negotiated away? The big issues on the Chinese side are part of the question of how far does China want to go down the road to an open market economy? To what degree does China want to have a modern legal system of the kind found in the major trading nations of the world? Or does it want to maintain its earlier traditions where rule of min rather than rule of law was the dominant force? On the U.S. side, the question, of course, is what role do we have in all this process? Does the United States have a role clearly the United States has a role in determining its own trade relationships, but does it have a role in using trade for some broader political purposes, not just for the narrow trade purposes? And if we do have such a role in linking, for example, trade to human rights, do we have an effective vehicle for that kind of role? Do we, in fact, have any capacity to have much influence on these issues, and is trade an appropriate vehicle for such a relationship? The panelists tonight are a distinguished panelist, highly qualified to deal with these issues, both with the specifics and with the broader issues. What we're going to do, as I said earlier, is begin with a specific discussion of the trade agreement, and therefore we're going to begin with Nancy Lynn Patten of the U.S. government, move on to Zheng Zhihai of the Chinese government, and then move to some of the broader discussions by Bill Alford and David Lampton to finish up. Nancy Lynn Patton was appointed to the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce, responsible for international economic policy for Asia and the Pacific, just about a year ago. Her responsibilities as the principal advisor to the Assistant Secretary for International Economic Policy include all matters concerning international economics, trade, investment, and commercial policy agreements and programs with respect to Asia and the Pacific. Before Nancy Patton was in the Department of Commerce, she worked for a good many years with IBM, beginning as a marketing representative in Detroit, Michigan, rising up to become manager responsible for IBM public sector marketing in the Washington metropolitan area. And in 1989, when you're talking about China, you have to maintain a long-term historical perspective. However, Ms. Patton doesn't quite make it back to in 1989, Nancy Patton was selected by IBM as a Brookings Institution Congressional Fellow to serve in the office of the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, in which she served both the Honorable Jim Wright and Thomas S. Foley during that period, and then, of course, later has gone into the government. She is active in Washington community affairs and has recently served as chairperson on the board of Studio Theater, as well as president of the National Organization of Chinese American Women. Nancy Patton, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Perkins. It is indeed an honor for me to be a member on the panel and to speak with such distinguished speakers here tonight at the ARCO Forum of Public Affairs. I can think of no better place than Harvard to engage in such a fruitful discussion on such an important topic as U.S.-China trade relations. First, what I'd like to do is to give you a little background on the activities leading up to the agreement, lay out to you the elements of the IPR agreement, and then discuss a little bit about how we see the impact of this agreement on U.S.-China trade relations and relations within the region. As you know, about a month ago, the U.S. and China were on the brink of a major trade war over the inadequate protection of intellectual property rights in China. On February 4th, the administration announced that the U.S. would impose 100% tariffs on over $1 billion worth of Chinese goods if an acceptable agreement for the protection of intellectual property rights could not be reached by February 26th. Shortly thereafter, the Chinese counter-retaliated and threatened trade sanctions on selected U.S. exports and less favorable consideration for U.S. companies for pivotal infrastructure projects. The decision that the U.S. made was based on an 8-month investigation of China's intellectual property rights enforcement practices under the Special 301 provision of the 1974 Trade Act. The investigation revealed that China had neither improved its enforcement of intellectual property laws nor halted the production of pirated U.S. products. It was clear that the Chinese had failed to honor its obligation under the 1992 U.S.-China Memorandum of Understanding Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights Protection. China, in effect, had remained a bastion of pirated U.S. products, including computer software, pharmaceuticals, agricultural and chemical products, audiovisual works, books, periodicals, and trademarks. Piracy continued to soar in all major urban centers along the East Coast. China was operating 29 CD and Laserdisc factories along South and Central China. And the manufacturing capacity of these factories exceeded 75 million CDs, capacity that is in those factories, in an environment or in a market that can only absorb 5 million CDs. The majority of these pirated products were being exported. Moreover, the piracy of computer software had been running as high as 94%, according to U.S. software industry, while the piracy of laser discs cassette tapes, videos, and movies had been close to 100%. On February 26th, after weeks of negotiations, the administration announced that the trade war had been averted and an agreement on the protection of intellectual property rights in China had been reached. President Clinton hailed this agreement and noted that we had achieved a strong agreement for American companies and workers. It's important to note that the cooperation and synergy realized between the government and U.S. industry throughout this negotiating process was pivotal in striking such a strong agreement. Okay. The administration negotiated with the full support of industry, and in our opinion, this was responsible for the strength of the agreement. The process also underscores the administration's goal of establishing an open and fair trading system in various fora, in multilateral fora agreements like the Uruguay Round, in regional initiatives like NAFTA, in bilateral agreements such as the one we're talking about now. Since its inception, the administration has supported industry overseas by working to remove trade barriers and to level the playing field. The commitment is based on a very simple reality that open markets and expanded trade opportunities create jobs and lead to the strengthening of the U.S. economy. Now I'd like to lay out some of the elements of the agreement. First, China committed to take immediate steps to address piracy throughout the country, specifically through the implementation of a 6-month special enforcement period, which began on March the 1st. China will crack down on piracy by eliminating large-scale producers and distributors of infringing products and prohibiting the exportation of such products by July and then by July 1st, investigations of all those CDs, Laserdisc, CD-ROMs, and computer software production lines suspected of pirating goods will be completed. Particular emphasis will be placed on achieving effective enforcement in key regions where there's a high level of infringing activity. To date, the government has raided and closed 7 factories, including the Shenfei Laser Optical Systems factory right next to Hong Kong. Second, the Chinese are obligated to ensure the effective enforcement of intellectual property rights. This will be accomplished through a number of ways. IPR rights conference working groups at the central, provincial, and local levels. This conference working group will coordinate the enforcement efforts and will draft and implement legislation and regulations. To prevent the importation or exportation of pirated goods, China will also create an effective customs enforcement system modeled on the U.S. Customs Service system and establish a verification system of audiovisual works. In addition, all intellectual property laws, regulations, provisions, standards, edicts, decrees, interpretations will be published. And the right holders will have access to judicial relief, including national treatment for civil filing fees and expeditious handling of intellectual property cases involving foreigners. A final element of the agreement centers on the enhanced access to the China market for intellectual property right holders. China has agreed to place no quotas or import licensing requirements on U.S. audiovisual products, and they have agreed to permit U.S. record companies to market their entire catalog of works in China and to allow U.S. intellectual property related firms to enter into joint venture arrangements with Chinese firms. Given the extensiveness and complexity of this agreement, enforcement will be a very important element in determining the success of the implementation. Cooperation is needed at all levels of the Chinese bureaucracy, from the central, provincial, and the local levels. In fact, the U.S. government as well as U.S. industry are in a very strong position to see to it that the Chinese government at all levels enforce the agreement in its entirety. For example, the agreement stipulates that the U.S. and China hold quarterly consultations on the implementation and effectiveness of the enforcement action plan as part of the agreement. as well as quarterly exchanges of statistics on their enforcement activities and information on the verification for verification purposes. Several U.S. government agencies, including the Commerce Department, will be working with Chinese officials. Commerce's Patent and Trademark Office, in conjunction with the Justice Department, will assist in the training of Chinese judges, lawyers, students, government officials, and business people on intellectual property laws. The Patent and Trademark Office will also assist in the training of personnel on the verification of well-known trademarks and on the establishment of an appeals process. U.S. Customs Service will assist its Chinese counterparts in intensifying border protection of pirated import and exports, establishing a central recordation system for the protection of copyrights and trademark rights, and creating a title verification system that I just mentioned to prevent the production, distribution, importation, exportation of retail sales of pirated audiovisual works. Furthermore, major U.S. associations, including the Motion Picture Association, the Software Publishers Association, will be able to establish representative offices in China. These organizations will help enhance the enforcement effort by assisting in the verification process. The agreement will not only prevent a major disruption in the growing U.S.-China trade relationship, but it brightens the prospect for possible reductions in our U.S. trade deficit with China and for even stronger trade ties in a number of other different areas. We see that the signing of the agreement has cleared a major obstacle in the U.S.-China trade relationship, including injecting a more positive tone in our relations and allowing us to continue on a more level playing ground. We have several very important bilateral initiatives underway. The Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, will travel to China, tentatively scheduled for this July, to participate in, or that is co-host, the U.S.-China Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, or known as the JCCT, with Chinese Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation, Wu Yi. The JCCT is our principal bilateral forum for addressing commercial policy concerns, including business and investment conditions, policy on business facilitation, intellectual property, market access, as well as other areas of commercial cooperation, such as commercial law and training. Additional bilateral initiatives include the full implementation of the 1992 Market Access Agreement. Further, our two countries jointly announced the agreement to pursue negotiations on market access for value-added telecom and insurance, that is upon resumption of WTO negotiations. The agreement also, we have agreed to implement a letter of intent covering sanitary and phytosanitary concerns, which will pave the way for increased exports of U.S. agricultural products. Also on the trade front, the two sides are considering ways to eliminate barriers to exports of U.S. computers, textiles, heavy machinery, and other products. Discussions on China's accession to the World Trade Organization will also be resumed. We anticipate the talks starting in Geneva, perhaps the latter part of April. We have pledges from both countries to pursue the accession talks on a flexible, pragmatic, and realistic way of addressing the issues relative to China's being a developed or developing country. Our position is that China will be characterized according to the Uruguay Round categories involved, so as to avoid the labeling debate on whether China's a developed or developing country for purposes of accession to the WTO. We certainly believe that this agreement will have a positive ripple effect, accelerating the development of adequate protection for U.S. Intellectual property rights throughout the region. The message is clear that we are sending to countries that produce pirated goods, and that is that the U.S. will take action against any country to ensure open and fair trade for U.S. firms. In summary, I would just like to say and to emphasize the importance of this agreement for U.S. jobs and for key U.S. export-producing industries and for the overall U.S.-China trade relationship. With improved intellectual property rights protection and enhanced market access, U.S. firms with intellectual property-related goods will see greater business opportunities in China. And at the same time, prospects for an improved U.S. trade balance with China are brighter. The agreement is good for China, too. It demonstrates the potential to potential foreign investors China's willingness to follow international trading rules and norms. This will go far in attracting high-tech investment necessary for China's continued economic development. We can't stop there, however. We must ensure full implementation of this important agreement and use it as a catalyst for important improvement in other areas, such as China's accession to the WTO, market access, other non-tariff trade barriers, and for the enhancement of U.S.-China trade relationships. Thank you.
We will be taking all questions at the end after all four speakers have made their presentations. Our next speaker is Zheng Zhihai, who is Commercial Counsel of the People's Republic of China in the Consulate General in New York City. He also concurrently serves as Standing Director of the China International Trade Association, member of the Academic Committee of the Research Center of International Economy, Trade, and Finance under the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Standing Director of the China Industrial Newspaper Association, Deputy President of the Association of Chinese Economic Information Press. And previously, he served as Editor-in-Chief of the International Business, which is a daily newspaper put out by the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation, MOFTEC as it's known in the slang term. He has written a number of works, including a book published in 1993 called Deep Feeling in Foreign Lands, and then other books related to his trade interests, the top 500 foreign trade companies in China, European Market Guide, and Dictionary of International Petroleum Politics and Economy, this over a period of a dozen years or so. Mr. Zheng was born in Hebei Province, has been educated in 4 different countries, beginning in Beijing at the Foreign Trade Institute, later with the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok, at Pace University in New York, and at the International Institute for Journalism in Berlin. Mr. Zheng, the floor is yours.
Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to make some comments about the agreement. As you know, the government of People's Republic of China and the United States reached agreement of protection of intellectual property rights on 26th of February after 20 months of hard negotiations in the spirit of mutual respect and equal consultation. The conclusion of the talks averted a trade war between 2 major trading powers and set an important basis for further progress of Sino-U.S. relations. The successful conclusion of the talks once again proved the trade disputes between countries should and can only be resolved with consultations on an equal footing. So long as we can see the long-term interests and overall relations between China and the United States, we can settle our trade differences through consultation on the basis of mutual respect and equality. The successful conclusion of China-U.S. intellectual property rights talks was applauded both domestically and internationally. People think it is no-loser solution. The agreement has brought significant impact to China's foreign trade. I just want to mention 7 points here. One is immediate impact is to avert China and the U.S. from a trade war. Failure to resolve this issue would have opened China to U.S. trade sanctions that set preemptive tariffs on more than $1 billion on Chinese imports. Although the volume is small compared with China's total export of $121 billion, it would seriously hurt the feeling of the Chinese people and would have brought Sino-U.S. relations into a phase of confrontation. Second, it further improves the investment environment of China, and more multinational corporations of high technology are more active and are willing to invest in China. The third, it brings positive influence on the stability in Hong Kong and the Taiwan region. Because of the heavy investments in mainland China by Hong Kong and Taiwan companies. Fourth, the implementation of protecting intellectual property right laws and effective enforcement against infringing activities will bring benefit to our socialist market economic system. That is what we want, even if there will be no such agreement. The fifth, it will bring positive influence on China's success to WTO. And it laid an important basis for Sino-U.S. economic and trade relations and overall Sino-U.S. relations. In order to supply this view, I will give you some facts here. Just a few days ago, the MOFTAC Minister Wu Yi and Ambassador Kanter formally signed the agreement last Monday. During Mr. Kanter's visit, the two countries reached consensus on a widened spectrum of trade issues. Kanter reaffirmed U.S. support for China's entry into the WTO as a founding member and agreed to further discuss the matter on a flexible, pragmatic, and a realistic basis. The two sides also agreed to address realistically China's entering the WTO as a developing country based on criteria agreed on the Uruguay round of GATT. On the other hand, China agreed to lift the suspension of the implementation of Memorandum of Understanding on Market Access signed in 1992 as soon as possible. The last point I want to mention that the Sino-U.S. agreement on protection of IPR is not an exclusive agreement. China's open up policy and the laws to protect intellectual property rights are facing every country in the world. The successful conclusion of the Sino-U.S. talks on IPR not only will lead to further progress of Sino-U.S. relations, but it will also promote the cooperation between China and other countries in the world. So that's all for my comments. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is William Alford. Bill is Henry L. Stimson Professor of Law and Director of East Asian Legal Studies at the Harvard Law School. Prior to this, he has served on the law faculty at UCLA and was an attorney with Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Kampelman. Did that have anything to do with the latest trial? But anyway, never mind. An adjunct professor of law prior to that at Georgetown University. He specializes in Chinese legal affairs and international trade and technology transfer. And we have the coincidence, or almost coincidence, of his having just published a book which you are welcome to buy. To steal a book is an elegant offense, Intellectual Property Law in Chinese Civilization, Stanford University Press, 1995. I think there's only one copy here, but I'm sure we can manage. Professor Alford has served as a consultant on Chinese affairs and on international legal issues for the World Bank, the Ford Foundation, various parts of the United States government, Clinton transition team, former President Carter, Governor Dukakis, and a variety of other foundations and governmental affairs. Since 1990, he has served as a dispute resolution panelist under the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement and is currently on the list of trade law specialists eligible to serve on such panels with respect to the North American Free Trade Agreement. He was served as director of the China Center for American Law Study in Beijing and as a founder from 1987 to 1991, and has a whole range of other activities connected with Asia and China over a long period of time. He got his undergraduate degree at Amherst. He had to spend time to get 2 MAs at Yale before he finally saw the light and came to Harvard to get his law degree in 1977. Bill?
Thank you very much, Dwight. And I'd like to thank our 3 visitors from outside for coming up to Harvard today. And finally, I'd like to thank the Institute of Politics for giving me 7 minutes in which to sum up 7 years' worth of research. I'd like to start with a brief observation about context. It seems to me that we stand now at the confluence of 3 signal developments in world history. First is the end, at least as concerns Europe, of the Cold War, and with it, the increasing dominance of economic considerations rather than strategic factors in foreign policy. The second is we really are at the dawning, for better or worse, of a new era of increased reliance upon law in international economic activity. Consider, for example, the adoption of the Uruguay Round, which not only creates rules now to govern a broader range of trade in goods, services, and intellectual property, but creates a new international body to oversee these rules and a new mechanism for resolving disputes about them. Third, as these other 2 things are happening, China is reemerging on the world scene in this new rule-oriented international economic order. Each of these 3 developments seems to me to be important in itself, and each, of course, will shape the other. Because of this confluence of these 3 developments, actions taken at this time that might otherwise seem isolated or transitory have an enormous capacity to shape the longer-term future. And it would seem to me, therefore, impose upon us an even greater responsibility than usual to look beyond the short term and think of the consequences of what we are doing. Now, viewed in this context, it seems to me that the events of the last month or 2 between the U.S. and China present a somewhat mixed picture. On the positive side, quite clearly, it is better that the U.S. and China were able to resolve the intellectual property dispute than not. And clearly, it is better than not that the 2 countries have taken these additional recent positive steps toward ironing out some of the economic problems that exist between us, and even advanced the time, it seems, for Chinese accession to the WTO. On the other hand, though, this is my role as academic skeptic, the agreement demonstrates that for all their differences, the U.S. and PRC governments do share certain characteristics. Those include a somewhat unfortunate tendency to misunderstand one another, a willingness to allow short-term interests to crowd out long-term considerations, and a difficulty in effectively preparing their citizenry for what lies ahead. Let me explain. Here, first turn to the United States. I will be somewhat more extensive in my comments about the U.S. After all, it is my government, and one of the things of which I am proudest as an American citizen is our encouragement of reasoned dissent. It seems to me that the U.S. has proceeded on a somewhat erroneous assumption that the adoption of effective intellectual property law in China is essentially a matter of will from Beijing, which in turn can be greatly sped up or expedited by the application of foreign pressure. This policy, it seems to me, is flawed in 3 critical ways. First, I believe, it pays insufficient heed to the question of what engenders respect for law in China or elsewhere. Second, it neglects other important American objectives, many of which I believe, ironically, would also benefit intellectual property protection if taken more seriously. And third, after a brief honeymoon, I'm afraid that this all may complicate rather than improve U.S.-PRC relations. I don't have the time here, my 7 minutes from Dwight, I don't have the time fully to explain all this. It's all in the book, which you can buy or pirate if you don't want to buy. But let me mention a few points that I will also be glad to amplify during the question period. With regard to the first issue, If we look at how intellectual property law grew up in the United States, or for that matter, virtually anywhere else in the world, we see that all nations engaged in piracy at one time or another, and that behavior typically came to an end not principally through foreign pressure, but when the nation involved had its own reasons for enforcing such laws and its own institutions for effectively doing so. That typically did not transpire until such time as the nation in question, it's really true virtually everywhere, until the nation in question was producing its own value-added intellectual property in great quantity, its political life was vibrantly democratic, its legal institutions were mature, and its citizenry imbued with a rights consciousness. And after all, that does make a lot of sense. Why should somebody protect rather complicated rights of very distant people if they aren't first in the habit of doing so at home? Now, if the process of building this kind of infrastructure has been difficult elsewhere in the world, and indeed it has, arguably it is proving even more so these days in China. Given a rather different historical tradition about copying, given the PRCs having been cut off for decades from the international marketplace, given the current state of research and development in China, given the difficulties that Beijing has in exerting its will throughout the whole country, given the fragility of its regulatory and legal institutions, and given limits that exist on citizen involvement in public life. My second point is that the administration, the U.S. administration, has allowed its desire to conclude this intellectual property agreement to overshadow what I believe to be very important additional U.S. concerns, such as pushing China further to come into closer compliance with a broader spectrum of GATT standards before agreeing to promote China's candidacy in the WTO, and improving Chinese human rights performance more generally. This relative neglect, I feel, is both unfortunate in itself and also ironically diminishes factors that might otherwise contribute toward the building of a more open economy and broader respect for law in general in China. The agreement, of course, as was said earlier, is good for Hollywood and good for the Silicon Valley, and I have nothing against making them happy, but I don't think we should equate their interests with all of America's interests. My third point concerns the impact on the longer-term relationship. I fear that inadvertently we have set the American public up for expectations that cannot possibly be satisfied by the Chinese side, notwithstanding some factories being closed down and notwithstanding or assuming even the best of faith on Beijing's part. And furthermore, I fear that we have sent the message that in the end, force is what matters in international affairs. It would have been nice, I think, had the administration made more effort to educate the American public about the nature of these problems and the time and money needed really to address them. After all, if we can spend $20 billion to bail out Mexico and $2 billion to help Russia, it would be nice to make a much more substantial commitment than we are doing to develop legal institutions in China, to help the Chinese develop those institutions. And I think, too, the administration might have made more of an effort to avoid treating U.S. business involvement in China on the one hand and concern for human rights in China on the other as essentially diametrically opposed issues, antithetical considerations. Because it seems to me that in the long run, these are really inextricably linked, interdependent, interwoven, and therefore it would have been constructive to have endeavored to show that more in this debate last spring on MFN and this more recent set of issues. My criticisms, though, are not confined only to the American government. On the substance, it seems to me that the PRC government has focused in this recent set of events far too much on the short term to the neglect of the long term. There is no question that citizens and even government units in China have been involved in massive unauthorized use of foreign intellectual property. I bear an example tonight, my necktie. This behavior, particularly by governmental units, it seems to me, undercuts incentives for Chinese producers. It results in foreign companies charging China more than would otherwise be the case for technology or simply withholding it. And I feel ultimately it demeans China internationally. I think a similar point might be made about meeting the requirements for entry to the World Trade Organization, or indeed about Chinese legal process more generally. Sadly, there is more of an attitude prevalent in China of getting away with as little as one can than would be desirable. This not only harms foreigners, but far more importantly, seems to me undercuts what is needed to build stable long-term development in China, because world history suggests that economic growth, mutually beneficial involvement with the larger world, and a constructive channeling of citizens' energies ultimately require a more effective, more professional, more regular legal system than now exists in China. On the negotiating side, my concerns about China in recent weeks are similar to the concerns I've voiced about the U.S. A negotiating style that accentuates confrontation only to capitulate at the last minute, as we have seen in each of the last two intellectual property agreements, sends the message that only force matters and inevitably reinforces skepticism. And promises that are certain to be misunderstood, such as that about ready access for U.S. audiovisual products to the Chinese market, are not, I believe, constructive for the long term. In short, both governments, I believe, need to recognize the implications of being at this rather extraordinary point at which we now are in world history, and therefore need to temper the short term with an appreciation of the long-term implications of what they're doing. Thank you.
Our final speaker is David Michael Lampton. Mike Lampton is currently president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which is the organization, as many of you know, that has been the primary manager of much of the non-official exchange relationship with China over a long period of time. As a member of the board of that organization, I can testify that Mike has brought enormous vitality and leadership to that organization over the last 8 years to the betterment of relations between the United States and China in a very important ways. He is, in addition to being the leader of the National Committee, he has been throughout his career a scholar and an academic. Before going to the National Committee, he taught at Ohio State University for a dozen or so years. His vita says he was in the Army Reserve for 15 years, but I think this is a mistake. It couldn't have been more than 5. And prior to that, got his all of his degrees, his BA and MA and PhD in political science at Stanford University. He has a long list of publications, of which some of the more recent ones include a book he edited with Ken Lieberthal on bureaucracy, politics, and decision-making in post-Mao China. He's recent articles to give you a flavor of the kind of things he's been working on, thinking about in recent years: America's China Policy in the Age of the Finance Minister in the China Quarterly, United States and China Relations at the Crossroads, China, the Coming Power in Foreign Affairs in 1992, and so on. Mike, you have the final say.
I don't know that it'll be the final say, but it will be a say. I'm glad to be here, honored to be here. I've always enjoyed coming to Harvard, and this is a very good panel we have tonight. I do want to thank the Institute of Politics. Also, I just want to say I've enjoyed all of the comments. I think, in particular, mine will build on Mr. Alford's. I think there was great wisdom in what Professor Alford just said, and I was quite struck. I would like to create a little broader context, however, and throw out a few facts. We haven't had too many facts about the U.S.-China economic relationship, and I think that's important in its totality. And then I'd really like to make 3 sort of overarching points that I think might spark some debate and put some context around things. As to the facts, I think it's very important to recognize that this economic relationship is becoming very important domestically in the United States. There are, at last count, 178,000 American jobs directly dependent on exports to China. And this is the administration, and we're a society as a whole that is very concerned about employment, economic development, export jobs, and so forth. China is becoming very important to the political economy of the United States, I think much more so than is widely recognized. Secondly, I think we have to recognize with all of the problems that we read about in the Chinese economy and in the Chinese polity, there has still been a remarkable record of economic success in China since 1978, and indeed, I would say even before then, but certainly in the era of reform. Real growth of 9% from 1978 to 1994. That is phenomenal, and I believe, as I'm going to explain in a moment, that's changing the power equation in the world. Thirdly, I think another fact we've got to keep in mind is China. We talk a lot about the poor investment environment and all the problems in doing business, and they're all real. In fact, there are many more problems than are generally mentioned. But the long and the short of it is that last year China attracted $30 billion in foreign direct investment, exceeded only by the United States. So China is doing something right in terms of attracting capital, all these problems aside. Finally, I think it's wise to keep in mind that China probably will spend on the order of, if anything like current plans hold to the year 2000, $1 trillion in infrastructure. This has enormous economic implications for the United States because what China needs is, in effect, what the United States has to sell. Agriculture on the one hand, but power generation equipment, aerospace, aircraft, and so on. So that what we are talking about, just to give you an example, is over the next 20 years, China will, at a minimum, buy $40 billion in aircraft. And the only question is, whose aircraft are they going to buy? They will buy, in the next 5 years, probably $40 billion in telecommunications equipment. And I could go on and on. Oil field equipment, next 3 years, $18 billion. These are all industries in which the United States is highly competitive. So I just wanted to put some kind of reality to the size of what we're talking about. We're talking a lot more than CDs and videotapes here. They're important, and they've been the focus of discussion in the United States for the last couple of months. But this is a much bigger economic relationship than just that issue, although much of what I just described has an intellectual property component that is very important. Now, let me just make 3 points that I think might provide some perspective. I think the United States can never forget that what we are witnessing, I think, at the current time is the emergence of a major new power. At least as important as, for world history, the rise of Japan and the rise of Germany. Probably, in some sense, will be more important for the world simply because more people are involved. The World Bank did a very interesting study that was released not long ago. It said in 1990 that about 55% of global economic output came from the so-called rich industrial countries and about 44% from the developing countries. The expectation is that by 2020 those numbers will have reversed, that the rich industrial countries in 2020 will be about 30% of global output, and that the now developing countries will account for something like 63%. To put it a different way, over the next 25 years, the World Bank would expect the developed countries now to grow at something like 2.7%, the now developing countries at about 5%, and my belief would be, and I would defer to Dwight on this, but I think China's going to do far better than 5% real growth over the next 25 years. We'll see about that, but I think I would certainly bet on them doing better than 5% by a considerable margin. So what we are going to look at is a relative shift in world economic power towards, I think, what we now call the developing world or the newly industrializing world. And China, I believe, is going to be on the leading edge of that shift. Now that brings me to my second point. I think that the United States and China fundamentally view the trade issue from a different perspective, and it's in light of this power shift that I think both are viewing it. For the United States, this issue of the intellectual property, the trade relationship in broader brush, I think is the question that the U.S. government asks is China, given that it is growing, going to be a good global citizen? Is China going to adhere to the regimes that govern international behavior? We're concerned about that in the human rights realm. We're concerned about that in the proliferation realm. We're concerned if China is going to play by the rules. And so the United States, I think, as a matter of strategic policy, believes there is no time like the present to cultivate the habit of playing by the rules. And so I think the United States, when we're talking about intellectual property or proliferation, it's not just the issue of intellectual property, it's the question of, is China going to recognize international norms and abide by them? And so there's much more at stake in this argument from the viewpoint, I think, of the United States government, certainly, than just the issue under discussion. I think from China's viewpoint, they have a different historical experience and perspective. And the issue is, will the West accept China as a world player? And will the West recognize that they wrote the rules and now the rules have to be changed or modified to accommodate China's rise? And if you look at what Chinese journals and political leaders are saying to themselves, they're not exactly clear whether the United States is now trying to keep China weak, keep China fragmented, keep China isolated. And so when we are reticent to move staunchly, in their view, on the World Trade Organization, they see that as a long historical pattern of trying to keep China down. When we use sanctions, they see that as hegemonism and pressure. And so what's at issue here, I think, is really two fundamental worldviews that are clashing in the area of trade, in the domain of trade. The third thing that I would just simply say by way of winding up, that there are obviously specific issues. We've talked about intellectual property. Very important are also the issues of market access. Is the United States going to be afforded, and indeed is the rest of the West and external countries going to be afforded access to the Chinese market? On what terms? Will services be allowed? Telecommunications, banking, insurance, those are important issues. There's the whole question of unfair trade practices that came up with respect to textiles. There's been a repetitive issue of avoidance of quotas and so forth. And of course we've had intellectual property not only this time, but we had it in 1992 as a major issue in our relationship. We have the growing issue in the trade area of human rights, workers and labor standards, the so-called forced prison labor issue. Those are all looming issues here in the trade area. I think when we look at U.S.-China trade disputes over the long run, we're really going to see them in three major areas. The trade deficit, from the American viewpoint, it may be of interest to note that China thinks it has a trade deficit with us, and we can go into that. But in any case, from the American viewpoint, we have an enormous trade deficit with China, second only to Japan, $30 billion in round number last year. I think so there's going to be that issue. Why don't we have access to China's market that will compensate for the surge of exports from China? There's going to be an ongoing problem, and I very much agree with Professor Alford on implementation. I think that it is almost inconceivable that the agreement that was just enumerated will be smoothly implemented. And I wouldn't even chalk that up to bad faith and perfidy, although there'll be, I'm sure, some of that as well. You are talking about implementing highly sophisticated laws in a society that still has perhaps 25% illiteracy, in which the central government only has imperfect control over the behavior of local officials at subordinate levels. You are talking about a management problem that involves 1.2 billion people, and I think it's the height of naivete to think that's going to be easily resolved. And finally, there's the very legitimate concern I think that China will have, and that is to protect its domestic producers. The simple fact of the matter is that China has 100+ million people in a floating population. It adds 15 to 17 million people to the workforce every year. It might unemploy 30 million in the state enterprise sector if it put out of production firms that really are not economically viable. And the simple fact is that China's political leaders don't need any more unemployment due to foreign competition. So there'll be a quite natural tug. So I agree with Bill that I think that this agreement is to be welcomed because the alternatives were significantly worse than that. But we shouldn't go the other direction and think that the problems are now resolved. In fact, I think we just are beginning to have a clear understanding of what the problems are. Thank you.
This is now time for the question period, and the procedure is that those who would like to ask questions should come to one of the two microphones over here, and I will go back and forth. But before we, while waiting for people to get up, would any of you like to ask questions of each other, or to comment on the others, or generally protest, or whatever seems appropriate? Or shall we turn straight to the questions?
I guess I would just like to say that we have established a comprehensive training assistance program as a result of this IPR agreement. As I mentioned in my presentation, the Commerce Department will be participating in commercial law exchange seminars. Our Patent and Trademarks Office will have exchanges of legal experts, and they'll do training on well-known trademarks, as well as training on an appeals process. The Justice Department will train judges. The FBI will participate in training individuals in China on criminal enforcement investigations. The Customs Service will engage in training on enforcement and investigations, and so I think there is quite an extensive program. As a matter of fact, the Asia Development Bank has just is contracting with China to provide them with $546,000 worth of aid in order to support this training program. So I would say that we're doing quite a bit. It's probably not enough, but it's certainly a start, and I think it's a pretty good start.
Bill, you want to defend that?
I think it's open for questions. Thanks.
Okay, I think we'll turn to the audience for questions. The first question.
Hi, I'm Marilyn G. Wax. I'm a Neiman Fellow. And my question is for whomever wishes to explain this to me. I have a hard time understanding how the Chinese government justified piracy. In that, I mean, I can understand if the government said, you know, it's very difficult for us to enforce these rules. We're having a tough time. Look, folks, we've got more than 1 billion people. It's not easy. Give us a little bit of time. But it seemed as if the government was actually saying, no, we just don't see this as a problem. Why didn't the government just at least admit piracy is wrong and we'll try?
Mr. Chung, do you want to try that one, or do you want?
And I think this for piracy is, I think it is a common phenomenon in the world, not only China. There is quite a number of countries, and I read articles a few days ago about Mexico, and some mentioned about Indonesia. And this is just like, you know, China's Asian, for this question, I think, how to judge it is a piracy or not, because this, for China's government and the U.S. government have made agreement, and to help China to make a very special, figure on the CD. That it is a very complicated technology, I think. Now we cannot produce now, but we need some help from U.S. government.
Right, yeah.
By that, very special figures that can judge it is piracy or not. It is just a technology problem, a technical problem, I think.
Mike, do you want to comment?
I'm not sure that I fully share your premise. I think it, to my recollection, the Chinese government never came out in a big public statement and said mea culpa. But what struck me, and I have many conversations with Chinese officials at provincial, county, national level across ministries, and what always struck me in my conversations for the last year at least was in fact how forthcoming they were that it was a problem, and in fact the strategy seemed to be describe its complexity in such detail that you, the foreigner, would understand how difficult it was and have a certain amount of compassion for the Chinese government that couldn't stop the problem. And I've had Chinese leaders and officials at various levels tell me there's a problem of, honestly, corruption in some cases where local officials have relatives or other connections to producers, and they find it difficult to intervene. I've had it explained to me that, we have a real public education problem here with a lack of legal consciousness in general and any widespread popular understanding of what intellectual property is in the second case. I've had it explained to me that, it's true that much of this is occurring in China, but you have to realize it has complex international origins, investment and distribution from Hong Kong and Taiwan is involved in this, so there's that level of complexity. And then finally, there was the revenue argument. And the revenue argument is that local governments now keep a lot of the tax base from their local producers, and these are very profitable, and they've become an item in the local budget, and unsurprisingly, local officials don't like to erode their tax base. So it seemed to me that when you really talked to Chinese privately, what you got was yes, it is a problem, and then a very complicated explanation as to why it existed. So I don't fully share the notion that they just denied it, that they don't have the habit of public expressions of guilt to a global audience, but I didn't find them denying the problem.
The problem is not exactly a new one. I can remember 30-odd years ago being in a conference where the senior editor of a major Japanese newspaper was arguing that all intellectual property should be free anyway because it's part of the knowledge, and then one could buy the Encyclopedia Britannica in Taiwan for $30 or some such thing, and almost any. So it's a problem that I think is part of the early stages of development. People make money at it, and it's not easy to suppress. But yes, next question.
Hi, my name is Joseph Feingold. I'm a freshman at the college. Just a question, perhaps Bill Alford could answer this. You've all commented on the intellectual property rights problems, and Mr. Lambton went into a little bit farther than that with the other firms going to China. But I was wondering, the recent problem with debt settlements, like with Lehman Brothers, if maybe you could comment on that a little bit, what provisions, if any, there are. Thanks.
Sure. Well, others may also want to speak. I guess I would also start with a caveat, a little like Mr. Lambton's caveat just now. Without for a second questioning the veracity of Lehman, I think both sides often are using the media in these kinds of disputes. Both sides are giving out their version. I don't know the specifics of that problem well enough to know the details of who is correct, but there is obviously a larger question that highlights, and that is that Chinese companies, as they're getting more enmeshed in the world economy, are discovering they're going to have to some degree, play by rules that have some semblance to internationally known rules, and that's a difficult transition. After all, many Chinese companies are very new at entering the world marketplace, and conversely, some American and other foreign companies are new at dealing with China. Part of my concern, part of the underlying message of what I was trying to say earlier is I'm very concerned about process, not just because I'm a lawyer, but because, as Mike Lambton's comments just pointed out, these disputes are going to grow and grow and grow. They may change and become more like disputes the U.S. has with Japan, but that would be the most optimistic scenario, and the less optimistic one would be sort of what we're seeing now. So I think it's very important, both for private actors and for the governments, to be figuring out reasonable, peaceful ways to resolve disputes fairly. I might say in that regard, the Chinese companies now are increasingly disproving the age-old adage about Chinese not being litigious by hiring Western lawyers and going to court to fight people like Lehman and Shearson and everyone else.
I just might add there, I don't know the specifics of the Lehman case. As I understand, Merrill Lynch had a similar set of problems and so forth, so it's not limited to one firm. But I would say there's a generic issue here, and that it's almost inevitably going to arise in this kind of transitional economy and transitional polity in some sense that you have in China. And that is simply the lack of clarity about when the sovereign power is guaranteeing debt. And it stems from that lack of clarity. When is the Chinese government really guaranteeing something with the full faith and credit of the Chinese government? There are lots of people in China that are officials, or say they are officials, or say they have the approval of some part of officialdom, that imply or even state that the full faith and credit of the Chinese government is behind something where some other portion of the Chinese government might not have conceded that at all. I think there's lack of clarity in some sense about who's an official. There's lack of clarity about if you are an official, what are you entitled to agree about. And then there's lack of clarity of exactly who's a businessman or where's the line between a businessman and an official. So I think that, and then if you just switch it around and say you're the entrepreneur on the American or the Western side, one of these cases involved a commodities trading and running up large margins by, I will say, avarice commodity traders, and suddenly the margins got called, and the question was who's going to stand behind the margin calls, and the Chinese government says, not us. We didn't authorize this. If you are a Western person making a commission, of course, the more trading that goes on, the better. And if you think a sovereign government is standing behind it, there are very few incentives to call the end of the game. So I don't pretend to understand all the complexity, but I think it stems from the lack of clarity about when the full faith and credit of the Chinese government's behind something, when somebody's an official and acting in their official capacity, and in fact even who's a businessman in this current environment.
Hi, my name is Dang. I'm a junior at the college, and my question is addressed to other panelists as well. I was struck by Professor Alford's comment about this copyright issue not as a matter of will, but a matter of reality, that we have to see China as this developing nation with a very primitive infrastructure, especially in the legal framework, and the need to educate the American public about where China stands now and how it fits into our national policy and what we can reasonably expect. But it seems to me that there's at a higher decision-making level, people who are doing the negotiations, there seems to me that they tend to take this sets of laws and impose on the other side without really actively engaging the other side's historical and cultural heritage. And it seems to me that there's a problem of misunderstanding or insensitivity at the higher level of decision making, and I just wonder if you could all comment on that.
Who wants to? I think Mike or Bill, I'll appoint somebody if none of you will jump in.
Well, I think Bill sort of pointed to the American quality of focusing more on American shortcomings and leaving it to others to conclude about their own. But I do think that the Chinese need a great deal more sensitivity about the nature of our system. And particularly, they have very little, in my view, understanding about the complexity of dealing with a pluralistic society such as our own. And therefore, there's a kind of insensitivity in that frequently makes problems worse in the United States after they get done dealing with us. So I think they need a great deal of to give you one example. The Chinese, Deng Xiaoping came to the United States and he was treated to an explanation about the United States government. We have three branches of government and so on. And finally, he threw up his hands and said, "How many governments do you have here?" There's a kind of frustration in dealing with us because nobody seems to be fully in charge. They therefore assume that they have to spend so they seem to assume that Congress is generally fairly irrelevant. They prefer to deal with the executive branch and frequently engage in things that erode support in Congress and then create problems. So I guess I would agree with your general proposition that there needs to be cultural and, let us say, more knowledge on both sides. And I think the Chinese have been notably defective, really, in dealing with our Congress. I think that's just a branch of government they really don't take with due seriousness and deal with appropriately.
Yes, I quickly want to reiterate, I agree. It really, I think, works on both sides. Now, I don't mean to suggest that understanding history, therefore, excuses certain kinds of behaviors, but I think it would be greatly advantageous. I think, for example, there are things in the 25 or so page agreement that had the negotiators been a little more conversant with issues beyond intellectual property in China would have been phrased more advantageously for all involved. For example, there's a indication that each enforcement task force, these are Chinese government task force that are going to be set up under this, will have the authority to enter and search premises, review books, seize suspected goods. I think if one were thinking more about the broader Chinese context and where we'd like to see China develop in the next 10 years, we might not want to encourage the Chinese police to take those kinds of additional measures upon themselves, just like we don't like the police here to do that. So I think both sides need, as Mike said, the Chinese side certainly could do with more sensitivity about us, and I think we could do with a greater appreciation of the implications of some of these things that we've included in this agreement. And I might say one last quick word. The negotiating style on both sides left a lot to be desired here. I heard from people, both American government officials and Chinese officials, about their own side, not about the other side, but how embarrassed each was at various points by the quality of comments made, not the substantive comments, but the kind of gratuitous rudeness, the kind of, these are difficult enough issues to deal with if everybody's acting as politely and as reasoned a fashion as possible, but when it then becomes personal, it only makes it much more complicated. So I agree with your comment and Mike's.
Okay, if we keep the questions and the answers relatively brief, we can get a number more in. So, yes.
My name is Paisan Surya Wong Paisan from Thailand, Bangkok, not Taiwan. I have a question to ask Mr. Lambton. When you discuss about the different perspective of U.S. and China views, I don't know whether it's just ideology conflict will develop into another Cold War when China grows stronger, like the U.S. and USSR have in the past, but not, in the future maybe a Cold War in economic terms instead of the military terms.
The question being, will there be a new Cold War with China? And I think that's highly improbable in my view. Absolutely undesirable, but also has highly improbable. And I think that's so for a number of reasons. First of all, I think we have these shared common economic interests that I was at some pain to describe. We didn't have those with the Soviet Union. There were many other origins of the Cold War in addition, but we didn't have that early binding economic. Secondly, I think we have a recognized shared strategic understanding about what's necessary for peace in Asia, and both have defined peace in Asia as central to their own economic future. So I think, to just be brief, we have shared economic interests and we have a shared strategic interest. We recognize that essentially there has to be a balance of power in Asia among China, Japan, the United States for sure, and Russia as well. So I'm quite optimistic that what we are in for is a series of sustained, acrimonious, issue-by-issue debates, but it's not going to degenerate into the kind of schism that characterized the Cold War.
Yes.
Mike Luo, first year at the college. I'd just like to make one observation about the discussion and then have a follow-up question to that. The observation is, it's interesting to me in this discussion about U.S.-China relations that three words seem to have been omitted, almost as if they're taboo in the discussion between U.S.-China relations. And I'm wondering if how the reassessment of the Chinese government's role in Tiananmen massacre is figuring in on U.S. policy, and whether the panel thinks it's counterproductive to U.S. economic interests to deal with these kinds of issues, a reassessment of the incident, and also the fate of political prisoners being detained.
But you want to start with Nancy Lynn Patton? Would you like to try that one? Or
well, as you know, last year President Clinton delinked human rights from MFN and made it possible for what we call commercial engagement to be pursued more vigorously, and I think that that was the right decision for the president to make. We have, I think, had very positive things happen since then. I mean, for example, this agreement is a good example. It is, I think, better to have engagement with China than to isolate them based on human rights issues. That is not to say that human rights is not important. It indeed is. It is an issue that is very difficult, and I think that we have a long way to go before we come to any resolution on it. So.
Okay.
Shirley Zhang from Kennedy School. I would like to hear from both China side and the U.S. side about the strategy, if you call it, using trade barrier as a tactic in your agreement outcome. Is there any, what do you perceive, is that effective or not effective use trade barrier? Do you plan it as a strategy or it's just an outcome? And on the China side, do you take it as threatened when U.S. announced to have an $1 billion, or you think, well, that's not going to be coming as a true statement?
That's first Nancy, then Patton, and then Mr. John.
If I understand your question correctly, you're asking me if the U.S. feels that using trade sanctions is an effective...
as an effective strategy in your negotiation.
Very definitely, because without it, nothing happens. So, in this instance and in 1992 in the previous IPR agreement, it was the same situation. And until we got to the point of trade sanctions, issuing a retaliatory list threatening to implement it, we did not get results until we got to that point. So I would say sanctions very definitely do work.
But from China's point of view, I don't think that the pressure and the sanction is the good thing, because everything should be concluded with negotiation. And you see, from recent years, and whenever we have we have conflicts with the trade issues, and the better way is to sit down and have a talk. Then maybe both sides make a compromise, then get agreement. I think that is the way. And you see, and the pressure and on sanction is no use. I don't think so that is useful.
Next.
My name is Jin He Li. I'm a research fellow at the Harvard Medical School. I want to answer from all of you. The government system and the political structure of China is so different from the United States. And for example, the Chinese government has a much more control over the nation's economy than the government here. So do you think this difference, with this difference and this political barrier, the relationship, economic relationship between the two countries and or say the trading relationship between two countries can develop in a healthy way, or would be limited in the long run if you look in the future?
Who wants to go first?
Let me make a quick comment. I agree and disagree with your comment. In some ways, the Chinese government obviously it has more ownership interest in companies than the American government. In other ways, though, the American government and all Western capitalist societies have more control over their marketplace than I suspect the Chinese government does these days. There aren't yet developed the full boundaries of a kind of organized, fair marketplace in China. So that's one of the big problems. In terms of...
Excuse me. They have more control over the market, but not the economy, the whole system.
Yeah, well, they're in transition, as Mr. Lambton said, and I think that obviously spawns lots of difficulties. As he said, it's hard to know who is signing a document on what grounds, what responsibility they have. It's even hard to know what is a company in China. Yes, there's a company law, but it certainly doesn't apply to many actors. I don't see the fact that there are differences in the systems as an impediment to economic engagement. The numbers are already there, as he suggested, and as our other two speakers did, and we trade productively with many countries in the world that have different organized systems. Well, again, I think that emphasizes the need for developing a good mechanism for ironing out disputes, of which there inevitably are going to be more and more. I hope there'll be constructive disputes with rather less threats and cajoling, but there are clearly going to be disputes, inevitably.
Okay. Next.
My name is Greg Alling. I work here at Harvard, but I'm also a student of Southern Asian Affairs. And I think this will be directed towards the right hand, or in my perspective, the right hand of the table. You sort of threw out the issue of human rights, and the bait has been thrown out, but hasn't really been taken too far. We had one answer. And to my question, I think I can anticipate the answers coming from the governments. But I'm curious to know what the other end of the table has to propose how the world can bring the issue of human rights in China and occupied Tibet to the international relations field. What can be done about that? Now that we've delinked it from trade, which in my opinion it was a very difficult issue to bring up together. And if you could in particular bring into the issue of occupied Tibet. And I bring this to the forefront not because it is more than a human rights problem in Tibet. It's an occupied country problem. It's a problem where the people who are there, the Tibetans, do not consider themselves part of China. And if we look at like what's happened in Russia, in the breakdown there, where we're finding situations like Chechnya, if we look at Yugoslavia, we see that the factions happen. So thank you.
Mike,
I just should say, Dwight and I and several other people went to Tibet in 1991 and wrote a report on this, and be glad to supply it to you if you give me your name afterwards.
I'd be glad to talk to you about it. I've been many times.
But in any case, I think there are a couple things on the broad human rights thing, then I'll say one word about Tibet. The first is that I think the idea that just because we're engaging in trade and we now have what we're calling commercial diplomacy and commercial engagement, that we've lost interest in human rights is really misstating the problem. If you start from the premise that helping, or let us say contributing to China's economic development creates the social base for a middle class, it would be my view that essentially a society without a middle class and without some property stakeholders in the system is not going to develop a legal system and is not going to develop everything that protects human rights. So I think the implicit notion that there's a contradiction between our human rights desires and our commercial interests and desires is not a contradiction that I believe. So I think by pushing that, we are promoting human rights. Secondly, to be more specific on how we can approach human rights directly, I think we just had a good example of that last week in Geneva, where the United States took the lead in the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, and China squeaked through with one vote on that and had to fight tooth and nail to avoid what for them was a very unsatisfactory condemnation of China's human rights. I think we are much better off when we work with the rest of the world community on the basis of shared values, rather than being the Lone Ranger on issues that, in fact, pursue a noble cause but with no notable support elsewhere in the system. So I would say on the human rights front, multilateralize it.
And last question. You want to say something about Tibet or not?
Well, only that there is a lot of controversy on almost every dimension you made, and I mean it's controversy, it's not open and shut, but I would say that I think that the world faces a practical question with Tibet. And the practical question is, and I think the Dalai Lama in his Strasbourg speech in effect outlined it, and that is the question has to be, how can we effectively create a space of genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people and a circumstance within the framework of a China, unified China, but that will protect Tibetan culture and Tibetan society. I think it would be my own personal belief that if the 2 million Tibetans in the so-called autonomous region push for independence, that they in fact will unleash a response from China and a set of forces that will lead to the destruction of that society, that civilization. So I think the practical question, no matter how tragic it may be from a variety of dimensions, is how can a workable degree of autonomy for the Tibetan people that preserves their culture be achieved. That seems to me, and if in the drive to achieve the maximal aim of independence, I think, will probably produce the extinguish that society over the long run. There's obviously much that can be said in response to just what I said, but I think that is the practical problem.
We're past the bewitching hour, but I'll take one more question, and then we'll have to stop.
Okay, I'll try to take advantage of this last opportunity so I have just one question, but it has two parts.
As long as relatively brief parts.
I'm really impressed with the comments by all the speakers, especially Mr. Alford and Mr. Lambton, who really understand the complexity of the issues. And my first question directs to Ms. Patton. And just out of curiosity, I wonder, like in the newspaper, U.S. claims that the piracy of the Chinese cost U.S. like billions of dollars. I wonder how you came up with this figure. This is my first question. My second question directs to all the speakers. Last year, I was doing research on foreign direct investment in China, and I talked with a lot of foreign managers. And one of the frustrations on their part is they had a very hard time figuring out who is responsible for what. And when I interviewed the Chinese government officials, and I had a hard time like figuring out, who should I talk to. So this relates to the concept, I think, very popular among Chinese scholars called fragmented authoritarianism. Like it's a kind of a description of the Chinese polity. I wonder, like, for U.S. investors, even if they got the market access, they got the assurance from the central government, how actually they overcome the real barriers, like this complicated bureaucracy, in order to get a foothold in the Chinese market. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. First, Nancy Patton's going to explain with charts and calculations exactly how she got that figure, and then we will.
Unfortunately, I didn't calculate the figure, but I presume that the way it was calculated was based on the production capacity of the factories in China. Some of the figures that I am aware of that I quoted were a production capacity of 75 million CDs, per year. And if you multiply that times the value of a CD, then you have an estimated cost to U.S. IPR holders of CDs. So they are only estimates. We figure actually that the figure is much greater than $1 billion in terms of losses.
The final question is, who's in charge of the store in China? Is that?
You've identified one of the key questions, and that is from the viewpoint of a foreign investor, who do I deal with and who's authoritative and so forth. I remember when now Vice Premier, then Mayor Zhu Rongji came to the United States in 1990, spent a lot of time with him. He said a foreign direct investor, as I recall, coming into Shanghai at that time needed at least 30 chops on it. And the big reform at that point he was suggesting was what he called his one-stop chop shop, where they'd all be put together. And I think, honestly, what one needs to effectively deal with that system frequently is a local partner with clout in the system. And that's one reason that joint ventures are an important vehicle for foreign direct investment, because you need somebody with both the connections and the understanding and hopefully the clout within the system to deal with the utilities people, the tax people, the personnel bureaus, the customs agents, and the more clout that the person has both locally and in national and provincial level bureaucracies, the better. So I think many foreign direct investors find the key decision is who should my partner be that can bring me the resources to deal effectively with this complexity that they'll never understand.
Bill?
Just a quick comment on the numbers. I think the numbers are very difficult to know with accuracy. I mean, certainly pirates don't like to report, even to professors, how much. I tried to ask them. At the same time, though, many U.S. companies are giving data to some parts of the U.S. government. I'm not sure if Commerce Department, but the U.S. ITC and others, that's based on manufacturer-suggested retail prices, which are clearly, if you're asking an ordinary Chinese who's making $500 a year, do they really want to spend $500 on that software or not have it? They're not going to spend $500. So the numbers are hard to know both ways. That also, if I can sneak in one last comment, Dwight, we shouldn't forget in all this that intellectual property is a contested area inside the United States, too, and that is Disney and Microsoft and even IBM and others who were vigorous here represent one viewpoint, and it may be the right viewpoint, it may not be, but it's one viewpoint about the need to have strong protections. But there are very respectable scholars and others, users in the United States, who say maybe it's better for our society or democratic societies to have a slightly less protectionist bent to IP. So we shouldn't, just assume it's China ripping off in America, always protecting. It's contested here as well.
Mr. Chung, would you like to comment on any of the recent questions, or would you like to?
For foreign investment, I think China is now come to the number 2, I think, last year. About direct investment is $34 billion, and U.S. it is $41 billion. I think it's number 1, and this means that China is really is a very good place for investment. And how to do? I mean, the problem is how to get a right partner when you establish a joint venture. That is, I read some articles and I took some seminars. I heard something about the guanxi, the connection, and I don't think that is the right. Sometimes it is not right approach, because in China, if you go to the local government, now every government have organization, that is a foreign trade organization. Sometimes call it the Commission of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. And you can go there and ask them to give me help. And because it is a joint venture, so you have to choose the partner carefully, because sometimes you cannot, even you establish a joint venture, but cannot get succeed. And so far, I think there's 80%, about roughly 80% of joint ventures get profits, but some still get the lose. So that is a problem.
Well, I'd like to thank all 4 of our speakers, Nancy Patton, Zheng Zhihai, Bill Alford, and Mike Lampton, for a stimulating discussion. I thank all of you for coming this evening and for your questions. We've run over. The tape may have run out, but I think it's time for all of you to go home and study. Thank you.